The rising inequality and growing political instability that we see today are the direct result of decades of bad economic theory.
The last 5 decades of trickle-down economics haven't worked. But what's the alternative?
Middle-out economics is the answer.
Because the middle class is the source of growth, not its consequence.
That's right.
This is Pitchfork Economics with Nick Hanauer, a podcast about how to build the economy from the middle out. Welcome to the show.
On today's podcast, Nick, we're going to be talking to a white male economist from Harvard, which I really gets into the core topic of the conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. We are going to talk to a white male economist from Harvard, but our guest today is a swell guy named David.
Despite all that, you're telling me.
Named David Deming, who joins us today because he wrote an article recently in The Atlantic where he insists that Big Econ, much like corporate monopolies, have become too concentrated, too centralized, stifling innovation. And it's become a profession that, rather than challenging the status quo, reinforces it. And right. We couldn't agree more.
Well, we know this. We could ask Ashley and Freddie about this. Our producers. We make an effort to try to have a diverse list of guests on this show, and it's not easy. Much easier if this was a physics
or chemistry or any other science
or medical podcast, medical research podcast, than it is with an economics podcast.
That's right.
Because the profession is the least diverse. If you consider it a science, it's the least diverse of the sciences and across the board in every aspect. And as David points out in his piece in The Atlantic, which I think is titled Break Up Big Econ, it's concentrated, the leaders of the field are concentrated around a handful of elite universities. Harvard, where he is, being one of them.
Yeah. And I think there have definitely been some downsides of that. But with that, let's talk to David and we'll find out more.
My name is David Deming. I am the Isabelle and Scott Black Professor of Political Economy at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm an economist. I study labor markets, skills, technology, education, future of work, AI, and all things in between.
You're one of those Harvard economists, so that makes you a member of the concentrated elite, right?
I suppose it does. Yeah. I don't feel that way, but that's what's funny about something like this is, I'm just like many of us in these positions. I'm just kind of a regular guy who found himself here. So I don't think very few people who are in the quote unquote elite feel as though they are.
Yeah, we're just 3, white men, not part of the elite, talking about economics on a podcast. Yep.
Yeah.
If you follow our podcast at all, David, you know that we're pretty hard on the discipline of economics. Or, whatever orthodox, the orthodoxy anyway. And, one of the really interesting angles that you take and that I suppose we had not really considered is how concentrated it is, how dominated it is by relatively few institutions and people, and in particular, how different that is from the other sciences. So, for our listeners, talk a little bit about that and try to compare and contrast.
Sure. Well, I should say that one of the reasons that the economics discipline is concentrated is because economists do research that's increasingly empirical, and that was a topic of my column that we can maybe talk about later. But relative to, let's say, an engineer or a hard scientist of any kind that has a lab and materials, economists' work is much less capital intensive. And so it's easier to move. So that's one reason why economists are more concentrated, just to be, I think, fair and transparent about that, is that you see a lot of patterns of people who start off in departments that are not at the very top, who, show their ability to publish in top journals and get grants and get cited and influence the field, and they end up moving to other departments. And so all top econ departments have a few people who came from a place that wasn't ranked very highly. And I think that's more true in economics than in other disciplines. Having said that, I think a main reason that the economics profession is relatively concentrated, in my view, is that we in economics are much more of an interpretive field than we like to believe. By interpretive, I mean something like the humanities, which is an example of a field that is reinterpreting existing work or existing things about society in new ways for people. This is an important function, but it's much more subjective than something that I would call purely empirical discipline. Like if you think about physics or anything in the natural sciences, often the title of the paper is the finding. We found this protein that did this. And you don't see paper. One thing I love about economics is it's kind of a bit of both. We uncover new facts about the world, but we also interpret them. And I think you see this pattern of greater concentration of major prizes in fields that are more interpretive. So like in the humanities, you see, much more concentration in art, in history. You see those scholars in those fields are much more likely to be in the very top departments, whereas the top scholars in, let's say, engineering or physics are much more widely distributed. Because if you have some great discovery, it's just that's the discovery, and you can win the Nobel Prize for that, even if you're at, the Ohio State University.
And because there are much more objective measures of whether it's significant or not. Like if you invent the airplane, now people can fly.
Yeah, and I should say too, Nick, just to be clear, I mean, I think that doesn't necessarily mean that it's like anti-theoretical. So empiricism and theory are not opposites. It's not that there's anything wrong with being more theoretical. It's just you have to understand that it's like whether a theory is true is inherently more subjective than whether an empirical result is true.
I have to think about that. Is that true?
It kind of puts economics in a difficult position because you can't categorize it as a natural science because it's not really a science, at least most of what orthodox economics does. But you don't want to classify it as humanity because over the past 50 years, it's largely been inhumane.
Well, I don't know about. I mean, I'm not sure I agree with that.
Oh, come on.
Good joke. But to be serious, I think that's one of the things I love about the field of economics, and when it's done right, is that it's a combination of theory and empirics, a combination of interpretive and empirical. So that's what's fun about it when it's done right.
But can we just go back to the thing that you just said, which is really interesting, is that empirics is easier to examine than theory. What's amazing about economic theory is how unaligned the theory is with the evidence, right? That's the frustrating thing about economics is that in theory, as you raise the minimum wage, you should have fewer jobs, as long as you assume a bunch of things which are not true about the world.
So what I would say about that, Nick, is it just means the existing theory is incomplete, not that theory per se is bad, right?
I'm not saying theory is bad, but theory should be connected to what actually happens in the real world, right?
I agree. And so the right way to proceed as a science is to develop theories and then test them.
Yes.
And those are two sides of the same coin. And so I think when you have scholars who are purely theorists and they're theorizing about how to interpret the world. So like, how should we think about big issues? Like Karl Marx was a theorist, Adam Smith was a theorist. These are people who were, the kind of titans of early economics before we could really touch data, before we could test a lot of the claims. Those are things where the way I decide how much I value that scholarship is much more subjective. It's like, does it seem like it has the ring of truth? Is it internally consistent? Is it beautiful? And so economists have kind of developed mathematical tools to develop theories that are sometimes beautiful and sometimes they're right. Like auction theory, was incredibly successful in the real world, but oftentimes those theories, people win prizes for those theories actually before they're put to the test. And so then what happens is if somebody writes a really good theory, everybody loves it, everything else they write is brilliant too because of the early developments they made in theory. And you see that in a lot of interpretive disciplines. Foucault, for example, once somebody establishes a reputation as a leader in their field, everything they write has the same halo effect to it. Whereas empirical work, it's much more one by one. Like, did you discover some really important, material compound? Did you make a new invention?
And when you do discover something empirically, that just invites a Nobel Prize winner to call you a camp following whore.
I don't know what you're referring to, but that sounds bad.
That's Nick does. It's the famous James Buchanan op-ed in the Wall Street Journal on the Kruger, the first minimum wage study to show that it.
Yeah. But the minimum wage is a great example of, in my view, of like how in the longer sweep of this, theory and empirical work can interact to develop something richer and more interesting. So we had these, perfectly competitive, like basically theories of perfect competition in labor markets where information was perfect. But that doesn't reflect the economics discipline today at all. And part of the reason is because people say, well, in this perfectly competitive economy, it must be that the minimum wage, increases in the minimum wage, will lead to employment losses. We don't find that. That must mean that maybe firms have market power. There's some monopsony. And so there's, some of the most exciting recent work in economics is developing theories of monopsony power.
That's right. And you can think of that as exciting. Or you can, because I suppose, what's $50 trillion between friends? Right?
$79 trillion.
Oh, is it $79 trillion now?
We're up to $79 trillion.
I mean, because in the real world, that view that markets were perfectly efficient and all this stuff did lead to a $79 trillion transfer of income from the bottom 9 deciles to the top 1% over the last 50 years. So these are pretty serious issues.
Nick, that's quite a theory. Do you have any empirical work to test it?
We do.
There is
huge amounts. Yeah.
We'll
send it
it's
to you.
based on the original Rand report from a few years ago. But there's an update coming that updates the numbers, the top line numbers on this. It's the due to rising inequality since 1975. Basically, it's counterfactual how much the bottom 90% would have earned had income distributions remained constant across distributions over the past 50 years.
So and you're assigning 100% of the credit for that to
rising in
economics? Economics profession?
Who's been guiding the economy for the past 50 years?
Yeah. I mean, look,
decisions were made, choices were made. It wasn't like inevitable that we were going to concentrate wealth and power at the top.
Yeah, and the consensus in the economics profession for decades was that there was basically a mechanical inverse correlation between the amount that you paid people at the bottom and the number of jobs in the economy. And I can tell you, because we do this work directly, 15 years ago, when I went and started talking to people, in the United States Senate, whether they were Democrats or Republicans, that consensus had completely shaped their view of policy. So it really wasn't until 2012 when we cooked up the $15 minimum wage that framework of thought began to get disrupted. But it was, that theory, which lives in academia, totally captured the policymaking apparatus and resulted in the minimum wage not tracking productivity gains, basically stuck at 1980 levels. The $7.25 minimum wage today, $2.13 per hour for tipped workers, is a byproduct of that consensus. That's how we got that.
So, I guess I would. We obviously we can't hash all this out. I taught a class for several years at the Kennedy School and in the econ department here called "The Causes and Consequences of Inequality." And part of what I did in that class was try to get students to apportion credit for different forces to the rise in inequality in the U.S. and globally since the 1970s. And part of the point was.
Where'd you guys come out? That's really interesting.
Yeah. So part of the point was to say, whatever your favorite explanation is, it has to be, if it's going to be monocausal, if it's going to be one thing, it has to be consistent with all the fact patterns. And it has to explain, for example, why top incomes rose in all the OECD countries, even though the top marginal tax rate changed in different times at different rates in those countries. So it can't just be taxes. It can't just be immigration, because immigration flows were from different places. And so where we landed on that was not a quantitative number, because that would be too precise. But just, I was trying to teach students the skill of weighing a bunch of different explanations in their heads, all of which are contributing in some ways, but none of which are fully consistent with any set of facts. And so I think that's a useful exercise. And I would apply that here to say, the economics profession surely deserves some blame for what's happened in terms of inequality in the country since 1970. But I would say also a lot of it is political decisions too. Is that the economics profession?
But the political decisions are at least partially informed by the economics profession.
Yeah. Of course. All I can tell you is when lefty Democratic senators deeply believe that if you raise the minimum wage, it will kill jobs.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
the chemistry department didn't come up with that. The poetry department didn't come up with that. It was the economics department that came up with that. And that to a certain extent has been the challenge of governing in the United States and in the West overall, because most of the West was sort of dominated by the neoliberal, this sort of generalized neoliberal framework.
And getting back to actually the core topic of the piece you wrote in The Atlantic, it wasn't just the economics department, it was the economics department at a handful of elite universities predominantly.
Yeah.
If you could go into that detail, it's what, like 8 schools? Is that what the number was? I can't remember.
It was something like 8 schools. Yeah.
Yeah.
And although, given our previous conversation, you might not be so excited about my prescription for that, which is to fund practical work, what I would think of as engineering work in economics at less elite departments. So that I would say, pour
100%.
more. Okay, good. So I would say,
we want more. This is economics equivalent of DEI. We're going to have more diversity and.
Okay. Diversity is the core value. I mean, I'm not against that. Yeah.
I mean, just because we are putting you on the spot a little bit doesn't mean we think.
I like it's fun. It's enjoyable. I don't mind it at all.
All right. Just because we're going to put you on the spot a little bit doesn't mean we're not trying to shoot the messenger or blame you for all of this. But the other thing,
away, Nick.
Right. But the other thing that I've always been puzzled by is hold on. Let me back up and say that human societies are constructs that are held together by stories, right? Yep. By narratives. And for all of human history, those narratives generally are produced by and benefit elites, right? The stories are not necessarily true, but they are very good for the people in charge, generally.
I mean, if they're the ones telling them, then yes, people like to tell stories. Everyone's the hero of their own story.
Yeah, exactly. So the economic narrative of the last 50 years has been massively biased towards the wealthy, right? Tax cuts for the rich create growth, deregulation.
In the U.S.
In the U.S., right. Yeah. In particular.
Well, I would say, it depends on what you mean by the past few centuries. Like, I would say that was more true in the 80s and 90s than it's been in the last 2 decades.
No, for sure. During that sort of neoliberal era, it really swung that way. And, in the 50s and 60s and 40s, it definitely wasn't, right? Productivity and wages went the same way. And then we had this big thing that happened where the academic consensus radically shifted. And the common story is just a bunch of old, rich white dudes who conspired to fuck over the poor, right, in the economics profession. But I don't think that that's true, right? Like there was no conspiracy. But what's your sense of why that happened? How did that happen?
And I just want to point out that the elites we're talking about here, it's largely old, rich white dudes.
I think in order to
dominate the profession.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, to try to understand this, I think you have to go back to the 1970s and think about what was happening in the country.
Yeah.
Inflation was super high. The economy was stagnating. People were upset. And so for better or worse, we were coming out of a time when the kind of centrally planned features of the economy and the kind of emphasis on, overregulation, whatever. I'm just saying this is the perception at the time,
for sure.
Was that people wanted something different. And, Ronald Reagan in his time was really and the Reagan administration was really what ushered this in. And it was in response to public demand. Part of it was a sense of wanting to increase national competitiveness to win the Cold War. It was trying to see some economic benefit from the big investments we've made in the military industrial complex, and some of those technologies were the early days of technologies like the internet and computers that were really transformative for society and kind of upended the winners and losers of the country. And so I think in that time, it some people would say it was needed, but it was certainly demanded. It was certainly requested.
Right.
And then what happened was that led to some excesses. It was, greed is good. And, we had the movie Wall Street and we had soaring incomes. And then I think what you're seeing now is a backlash to that. So I think of it as actually, this is not going to be surprising. I'm the two-handed economist in the classic trope. I would like to have something in the middle of those two.
Yeah. No, I agree.
I think that competition is one of the greatest forces. Economic competition is one of the greatest forces for good in all of human society. And I think what you see oftentimes is the relatively well off insulating themselves from
Yes,
competition through crony
100%.
capitalism. So I actually, for me, there's something actually quite beautiful about neoclassical economics. I just think that what happens is people, under the guise of neoclassical economics, do things that that aren't very competitive, that end up benefiting rich people. So I see a lot of what the excesses of that age are as being actually non-competitive capturing of the economy.
100%.
So
100%. 100%. And we could have a multi-hour conversation about this, but
yeah,
part of what led us there, I think, are again some of the underlying assumptions that make you want to believe those things. So, for example, the idea that seeing the economy as a Pareto optimal equilibrium within which a thing like efficiency can be possible. Now, if you assume that, if you assume certain things, then other things become possible. If you don't assume that it's a Pareto optimal equilibrium, if you think of it as an ecology in which the word efficiency actually doesn't really apply, then you end up just in different places and different stuff. But let's not go down that rat hole. Let's talk a little bit more about David's prescription for how to make the economics profession better. Because I thought in your article, I thought you had really good ideas.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that.
To be clear, it was written before the Trump administration started slashing federal funding for research.
It was, and I have since written another article for the Atlantic about the folly of cutting NIH funding. So I guess I'm on that beat. So my prescription was, look, if the problem, the state of the economics profession is that it's a mix of humanistic or interpretive and empirical, as I said earlier. And what you see is increasing concentration of major prizes and funding and just kind of clubs in more interpretive fields. That's, I think, it's not something anyone's doing on purpose, to your point, Nick. It's kind of inherent to the exercise.
Yeah. It's like these are measures of what our favorite thing is in many cases, right?
Yeah, and it's more about trends, what's hot,
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And so my solution was to create, through a variety of incentives, which is a economic, classic economic point of view, is to create various incentives through a mix of government funding and kind of social status and a program on both sides of like valuing what I would call economic engineering more. So solving practical problems using the tools of economics. And I think sometimes that involves using highbrow theory, mathematical theory. I gave the example in the article of auction theory and how, auction theory was used to auction off FCC broadband spectrum. And, Paul Milgram and Bob Wilson won the Nobel Prize for that. And that was like literally save the government billions. And so it's not about theory versus empirics. It's really about valuing practical contributions and not just can you publish an elegant paper in a top journal and have it be highly cited by your peers. It's about an impact test in the world. And my argument was the best way to do that is for agencies like the NIH and the NSF to fund impactful economic research, not to do things like give, most of the NSF's money in econ is given to early career awards. So finding the top people in the top departments and giving them unconditional money drops, and NSF doctoral fellowships, which is funding graduate students at the top departments. And I'm not against any of that.
Yeah.
I would like more. But if you push me and said you have to be budget neutral, I would say let's do more funding of high impact projects, the bridge building analogy, like how to create good markets that reward, that link buyers and sellers, how to like, have a more transparent monitoring system for the health of the economy, creating new data sets, all things that just provide public value. I would be funding those things.
Yeah.
And I think that would make the profession more egalitarian. It would also make the world a better place.
Yeah. I mean, I'm often struck when I meet with economists sometimes how uninterested some of them are in what's happening in the real world, right?
Yeah.
Like, and you're like, and I'm like, so how is this going to help the average American? And they're like, what?
It's so hard to mathematize that, Nick.
Yeah.
You've put that into
Should
a
economists
model.
have to sign the same thing that doctors do about whatever? Helping people?
First student harm.
Yeah.
And I think, actually, so when I wrote this piece, I got a lot of, it obviously generated a lot of conversation in my profession. I got a lot of notes from people.
Did you get a lot of hate mail?
No, a few. No hate mail. Some people thinking I was wrong. They weren't unkind about it. They were engaging. But the thing that I found very striking was that I got like almost universal positive feedback from the more junior members of the discipline. And often they were people saying, hey, we're doing this already. I do think people my age and a bit younger are like much more into this way of work. And
Yeah.
some of the work I'm most excited about in the economics profession is work happening among people who are, graduated around the time I did or later, who are out there in the world doing really interesting things. So a lot of it's already happening.
Yeah, you also, and I don't think you used the word, but I think if I read the piece correctly, you also think we need to do something to change norms within the profession, particularly in terms of what you're awarding, that there's almost no awards in economics that are, predicated on, I don't know, improving people's lives.
Yeah, or even just impact in the real world. So like one example, I think I got cut from the piece for space, but the Society of Labor Economists. I'm a labor economist, so I know that well. Has an award they just started called the Ed Lazier Award, and it's an award for a mix of people who've had for people who've had a mix of research impact and policy impact. And the first award went to John Aboud, who I don't know if you know John Aboud, but a really distinguished labor economist who also has worked tirelessly for years to improve the census and has worked to improve data access to the census. So it's like an award that says, look, you're a scholar, but you've also made contributions in terms of public impact. And I would just like to see more of that. It's not that we have to do one or the other. It's like, you should be rewarded explicitly and implicitly in terms of norms for taking your insights into the world and making it better.
And that's very different than, like the Nobel Prizes for actual sciences, where you're often rewarded for practical results.
Yes. I mean, well, part of it is inherent to the field itself. So if you discover, if you make some scientific discovery, regardless of what university you're at, it's just clearly valuable and it leads to downstream innovations. And so, there are lots of examples of that in the natural sciences and the physical sciences. And I actually think in economics, we have that too. I do believe economics is a science. And I think we can make it more so by being a bit more systematic about our discoveries. I think you're seeing a lot more of that. People taking replication much more seriously, making data sets public. It's all part of a process that we've undergone in the profession in response to criticisms such as yours. And I think those are healthy and fair criticisms.
I made the DEI joke, but if you're going to call economics a science, I mean, there's various papers that show that it is one of the least diverse. It is the most, in terms of gender equality, racial equality, and a more recent study on socioeconomic equality, that it draws people from higher income backgrounds disproportionately.
Isn't the woman that we interviewed on that Harvard researcher too?
Probably, because they're all at these 8 schools, Nick. Yeah. and I'll tell you, it's been a struggle on this podcast as a couple of old white men trying to get guests who aren't, at the very least, white men. We make an effort to try to keep our guests diverse, and it's hard. I mean, we have to go out of our way to do it because when we're interviewing economists, because the number outside of the profession, it's a lot easier. But it is so dominated by white men of a certain socioeconomic background.
So Goldy, I share your view that the profession should be more diverse and have done some work, as many of us have, to try to make that happen. I think that's an important goal. I agree with it. But as far as I don't think that really speaks to whether economics is a science. For me, what a science is
I'm not saying that. I'm saying, but I'm just comparing it to other sciences. That
I see.
This is an apples to apples comparison. If you compare it to other scientific fields, those fields, the hard sciences in particular, are really diverse. It's a lot of first generation Americans within the U.S. It's drawing from broader socioeconomic backgrounds. It's more gender diverse. It's more racially and ethnically diverse. Whereas economics, if you're comparing it as a science, it is the least diverse of the sciences.
Yeah, well, I deplore that too. I just think those are separate issues. To me, the definition of a science isn't based on who's in it. It's based on whether the profession moves forward a body of knowledge. So do we build on our discoveries? Do we learn from our mistakes? Do we update our theories and our empirical results? And I think, no science is perfect, and economics is no exception to that. We've got a lot of work to do. The profession's been wrong about a lot of things. But I think I feel like we know more in economics than we did 20 years ago, and we're building a body of knowledge. And for that reason, I'd call it science.
Okay, a couple of final questions. So the benevolent dictator question, if you were the king of economics,
If you were the Elon Musk of economics.
Yeah, if you were the Elon Musk of economics, and then we just subtract the sociopathic narcissism, and assume that you're not that.
Yeah.
What would you do with the profession?
Yeah, I would influence all of the major professions in the organization. So that's the NBR, the National Bureau of Economic Research, the American Economic Association, and all of the other associations to basically spend all of their resources on providing public goods and encouraging other scholars to provide public goods. By that, I mean the creation of new data sets and, creating more incentives to do essential descriptive work about the economy. So I think professionally, we have very little incentive. Let me give you one example. I recently, with a couple of co-authors, Alex Bick and Evan Blandon, produced what we think of as the first nationally representative survey of generative AI usage in the US. So, it's been cited a million times already. It's incredibly high value work, but people have we're having trouble getting it published, to be honest, because it's just simple descriptive work. Like what share of people are using AI, who's using it, what are they using it for? That kind of work is in my view, horribly underprovided in economics because it's hard to publish in a top 5 journal. And to me, that just demonstrates, again, it's not that I'm tenured at Harvard. I don't care if it gets published this is not me complaining about where it's published. My point is there's a lot of junior scholars out there who could collect important economic data and have very little incentive to do it. So I would, if I could wave a magic wand, that's the one thing I would change about the profession is I would tweak the incentive so that everyone has a much stronger incentive to create data and to create basic insights about how the economy works to inform decision making. And I think we should be professionally rewarded for that. That's a huge hole in the profession, in my view.
I don't know. On the one hand, you have actual empirical data on how AI is being used. And on the other hand, you have Elon Musk telling you how it's being used, which is more authoritative.
Well, I think minus, because he's just one guy.
And yet he's the one with all the rewards.
Yeah.
For now.
Oh, God, yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry.
I mean, listen,
I'm in
life
the
isn't
mood
fair.
today.
Yeah. Remember Robespierre. That's all I'll say.
No, but I actually, I think that kind of change, not only would it make, the primary value of it was it would make society better. We would make better decisions about things that really affect people's livelihoods. But the other thing is I really do think it would make the economics profession more diverse, not just, ethnically and, in terms of socioeconomic background, but just like a wide variety of people would go into it. They would see the value of it. We would, and so I think it would improve the public's perception of economics because we'd be providing something of more value. So
it's great.
That's my magic wand.
One final question. Why do you do this work?
Because I love it. To me, this is like a hobby more than a job. Like I just get excited about it. I really do. Like I wrote that piece because I was hoping to influence the profession in a way that I think creates more value for the world. And I got into this job because I felt like it was a way for me to use my, frankly, just like data nerd skills to help people. And that's why I'm doing this. And I still think it's a really valuable thing to try and do.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, David, thank you so much for being with us. It's really fun.
My pleasure. It was fun.
I hope we will see you again on the podcast.
Yeah,
Best of luck on your work. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks a lot.
We weren't that mean to David, but we did put him on the spot a little bit.
It was a dialectic, Nick.
Yeah. But great guy, and I think really on to, I think, an important problem. I thought it was a really interesting conversation because it really did highlight some of the stuff that has emerged, but you don't really think about the source of.
And I think, Nick, we need to get into a little bit about why this is important. And that is, we've made this comparison to, corporate America, how it's monopolized by big, powerful corporations. And that reduces competition and innovation. And that's a really important point, that there just isn't a lot of competition within the econ field. Because if you want to make it in the econ field, if you want to be a prestigious economist, if you want to potentially win a major prize like the Nobel, or you want to be named to the Federal Reserve or the Treasury Department or some top administration official, you need to go along to get along at these handful of elite universities. And so you're not incentivized to rock the boat in any way.
Yeah.
The other thing is, and this is something we haven't talked about for a while on the podcast, but one of the core assumptions that we make in our own economics is that when I talk about diversity, and I brought that up a couple times, it's not about fairness. It's not, I mean, it is, but it's not simply about fairness. It's that this is where innovation comes from. You want cognitive diversity, and you don't get cognitive diversity if you, out of a set of institutions that don't have socioeconomic, gender, racial, etc. Diversity. You're not going to get as much out of it. So when you have a profession dominated by the same type of people working at the same type of institutions, you're going to get less innovation because you have fewer people working at these problems, coming at it from different perspectives, which is where innovation comes from. And so that has, I think, arguably led to stagnation within the field for a very long time. That's why it's important.
For sure.
And because it's such an influential field in terms of politics and policy, you want that competition and diversity to be there.
Yeah, and you know the truth is that I don't care if you're a scientist or I suppose the best scientists are better at how do I put this? The thing about people is what we believe is rarely based on facts and evidence. It's what makes us feel good. And if you're an old white rich guy, an economic framework that privileges old white rich guys is just going to feel better than one that privileges people who are not like you. And so, if the profession had been more diverse over the last 50 years, but socioeconomically, racially, gender, I think it's likely that we wouldn't have ended up with these frameworks so much, because a lot of people who were in the field would have pushed back on them. They would have been like, tax cuts for the rich probably don't create growth. That's just a thing rich people say to poor people.
Oh, you're just a camp following core, Nick.
So. Yeah.
I mean, you are challenging the core principle of economic science. I mean, I go back to that Paul Romer piece that I mentioned, the trouble with macroeconomics, and a weirdly funny paper by an economist, but in his abstract, he compares the past 50 years of macroeconomics to string theory. He says a parallel with string theory from physics hints at a general failure mode of science that is triggered when respect for highly regarded leaders evolves into a deference to authority that displaces objective fact from its position as the ultimate determinant of scientific truth. And to some extent, Nick, this is what we've been pushing back here on this podcast for years.
Yeah.
That there is scientific truth out there. And, David's not wrong. A lot of people in the profession understand this. They accept it. It's talked about within the profession. It just doesn't come through to the people making the decisions.
Correct. And that's the big problem, is that you can still get away with saying that lower taxes for rich people will be good for the economy, or that raising the minimum wage will be bad for the economy, right? Like that's the problem.
Which is why we're about to get tax cuts for the rich and no increase in the minimum wage.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, that was fun.
Yeah. Again, if you want to read more from David, we will provide a link to his piece in The Atlantic, Break Up Big Econ.
Pitchfork Economics is produced by Civic Ventures. If you like the show, make sure to follow, rate, and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on other platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at Pitchfork Economics. Nick's on Twitter and Facebook as well, at Nick Hanauer. For more content from us, you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Pitch, over on Substack. And for links to everything we just mentioned, plus transcripts and more, visit our website, pitchforkeconomics.com. As always, from our team at Civic Ventures, thanks for listening. See you next week.